Your property is in violation. You have 14 days to comply, or we will take action. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed, measured, final, carrying the weight of an institution behind every syllable. She was standing at the edge of my south pasture fence, one hand resting on the top rail as though she owned it, wearing a blazer the color of a rain cloud, a tablet tucked under her arm. The morning was cold enough that her breath came out in small white puffs, and the grass behind her was still silver with frost. I had been out since before first light moving cattle off the lower field, and my boots were wet through, and I was not in a mood to be lectured. But I stood there and listened, because that is what you do when someone hands you information about what they believe. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that the pasture she was standing beside, the gravel road she had driven in on, and the 3 acres of freshly poured concrete where their new clubhouse now sat, all of it was sitting on land I owned, free and clear. The deed was in a drawer in my kitchen, right where my grandfather put it in 1961, and it had not moved since. Drop a comment, tell me where you're from, and if something like this has ever happened to you, I want to hear it. My name is Carl Whitmore. I have lived on this land my entire life, and I intend to tell you exactly how this went. The land came to my family the way most good land comes to people who end up keeping it, slowly and at considerable cost. My grandfather, Elias Whitmore, bought the first parcel in the spring of 1947. He was 31 years old, a veteran of the Pacific Theater, and he had saved every dollar of his separation pay plus 3 years of wages from the grain elevator in town. The parcel was 280 acres of rolling grassland and timber in the hill country of central Tennessee, bisected by a seasonal creek that ran clear in spring and nearly dry by August. He paid $4,200 for it in cash because he did not trust banks the way his father had not trusted banks, and that distrust had been earned honestly by both of them. He built the first structure himself, a 2-room cabin with a stone chimney, and he ran cattle on the south pasture from the second year forward. The south pasture was the best ground on the property, flat, well-drained, sheltered from the north wind by a ridge of old-growth cedar and hickory that Elias refused to cut even when timber prices were high enough to tempt a lesser man. He said the trees were older than anyone's opinion about them, and that was reason enough to leave them standing. I have thought about that line many times since. Elias added a second parcel in 1953, 90 acres to the east, and a third in 1961. Another 45 acres along the western boundary that included the gravel road, the only road connecting the property to the county route. That road had been there since before anyone could remember. It ran along the western edge of the south pasture, crossed a low wooden bridge over the creek, and met the county blacktop at a gap in the cedar line. When Elias bought that western parcel, he bought the road with it. The deed was specific. It named the road by its surveyed center line, described the right-of-way as 30 feet wide, and recorded the instrument in the county register on the 14th of March, 1961. I know the date because I have held that document in my hands more times than I can count. My father, Raymond Whitmore, took over the operation in 1978 when Elias's knees gave out and the winters got too hard. Raymond was not a sentimental man, but he kept the land the way his father had kept it, methodically, without drama, with a preference for cedar fence posts and a deep suspicion of anyone who arrived uninvited in a clean vehicle. He paid the property taxes every year by the 15th of January, never late, and he kept the receipts in a manila envelope in the same kitchen drawer where the deed lived. Raymond died in the spring of 2009, and the land passed to me. I had been working it alongside him for the better part of 20 years, so the transition was less a change of ownership than a change of signature on the tax forms. I kept the cattle operation, maintained the fence lines, and continued cutting hay on the south pasture every summer the way it had been done for 60 years. I did not think much about the neighbors to the north, a residential development called Clearwater Ridge that had gone in sometime in the late 1990s on land that had once been a failed turkey farm. They had their roads and their houses and their homeowners association, and I had my pasture and my cattle, and for the better part of a decade, that arrangement suited everyone. The South Pasture is roughly 60 acres, running north to south, bounded on the west by the gravel road, on the east by the creek, on the south by the cedar ridge, and on the north by a wire fence my grandfather strung in 1954 and that I have restrung twice since. It is good grass, bluegrass, and fescue with some native clover in the low spots, and it has carried between 40 and 60 head of cattle every grazing season for the better part of 75 years. The soil is dark and deep, and it smells in the early morning after rain like something that has been tended for a long time. That smell is not metaphorical. It is the actual smell of cultivated ground, and it is different from wild ground, and anyone who has farmed knows the difference without being told. The Clearwater Ridge HOA had been expanding its amenities program for several years before any of this began. I knew this in the vague way that you know things about neighbors you do not interact with. A word here and there at the feed store, a mention from my neighbor Dale Hutchins, who lived on the county route and paid attention to what moved on it. Dale told me in the fall, before all of this started, that there had been talk at the HOA meetings about a new community clubhouse. I did not pay this much attention. People plan things all the time. Plans are not the same as actions. The action came in late winter. I noticed it first from the cab of my tractor crossing the South Pasture on a February morning to check the fence line along the north boundary. There was equipment on the other side of the fence, not parked, working. A skid steer and a small excavator, moving earth on what I had always understood to be the northern edge of my property. I stopped the tractor and sat for a moment, watching the machines move. The ground they were working was inside my fence line, not adjacent to it, inside it. I drove back to the house and pulled the deed from the kitchen drawer. I spread it on the table alongside the survey plat that Raymond had commissioned in 1994, a clean drawing with precise measurements and boundary markers, stamped by a licensed surveyor and recorded with the county. I located the north boundary on the plat, measured the distance from the fence line to the boundary marker on paper, then drove back out and paced the same distance on the ground. The equipment was operating approximately 40 feet inside my property line. I did not go over the fence. I did not speak to the equipment operators. I went home, called my attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who had handled the estate paperwork when Raymond died and who had a reputation for being thorough to the point of stubbornness, and I told him what I had seen. Gerald said to document everything and not to move anything or speak to anyone until he called back. I spent the rest of that afternoon with a camera, photographing the equipment, the disturbed earth, and the fence line from multiple angles. I photographed the boundary markers, 4-inch steel stakes driven by the 1994 surveyor, still in place, still visible if you knew where to look. I noted the time and weather conditions in a small notebook I kept in my coat pocket for exactly this kind of thing, because my father had taught me that the value of a record is determined entirely by when it is made, and records made after the fact are worth considerably less than records made in the moment. Gerald called back the following morning. He had already pulled the HOA's recorded plat from the county register and compared it against my deed. His voice had the particular quality of a man who has found something he was not entirely surprised to find, but is still quietly astonished by. "Carl," he said, "they've broken ground on your land." I told him I knew that. "They appear to believe," he said, "that the northern boundary of your property runs along the fence line rather than the surveyed boundary markers." I asked him what the recorded instruments said. He told me the recorded instruments were unambiguous. The surveyed boundary, as described in the 1961 deed and confirmed by the 1994 plat, ran approximately 40 feet north of the existing fence. The fence had been strung in the early 1950s as a working cattle barrier, not as a legal boundary marker. Someone at the HOA, or their contractor, or their title company, had looked at the fence and assumed it was the property line. They had not checked the deed. They had not checked the plat. They had not ordered a survey. They had simply looked at the fence and started digging. Gerald sent a certified letter to the HOA board that same week, notifying them that construction was occurring on land owned by Carl Whitmore, citing the deed instrument by book and page number, and requesting an immediate halt to all work pending a boundary survey agreed upon by both parties. The letter was signed, dated, and sent return receipt requested. The board's response arrived 12 days later. It was written on HOA letterhead, signed by the board president, a woman named Patricia Lund, and it informed Gerald, in language that was confident to the point of being dismissive, that the board had reviewed the matter and was satisfied that construction was occurring within the boundaries of common area land, as described in the Clearwater Ridge Plat of Record. It did not cite a specific instrument number. It did not reference my deed. It did not acknowledge the 1994 survey. It simply stated that the board was satisfied, as though satisfaction were a legal standard. Patricia Lund had been board president for 3 years. Dale Hutchins had told me about her in the way that people in small communities convey essential information about difficult personalities, carefully with specific examples. She drove a white SUV that she kept immaculate regardless of the season. She had reorganized the HOA's enforcement committee in her first year and tripled the number of violation notices issued to residents. She had a way, Dale said, of speaking in declarative sentences that made her assumptions sound like established facts. The construction continued. By the time Gerald's second letter arrived at the HOA's registered address, the concrete slab was poured. By the time the board acknowledged that second letter, which took another 3 weeks, the framing was up. I documented all of it. I photographed the structure at every stage of construction, dated and logged, kept in a folder on my kitchen table alongside the deed and the survey plat and Gerald's correspondence file. The folder grew heavier as the structure grew taller. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that. Anger would have been a distraction. What I felt watching that building go up on my south pasture was something closer to professional interest. The focused attention of a man who has learned that patience is not passive, that waiting is itself a form of preparation, and that the record you build while the other party is still acting is the record that will matter most when the acting stops. Gerald filed for an emergency injunction in the circuit court on a Thursday morning. The filing cited trespass, unauthorized use of private property, and conversion of real property, and it attached as exhibits the 1947 deed, the 1953 deed, the 1961 deed, the 1994 survey plat, and 37 photographs taken between the first day of excavation and the date of filing. The injunction was granted the following Tuesday. The construction stopped. Patricia Lund arrived at my fence line 2 days after the injunction was served. She came alone this time. No clipboard, no tablet, just the white SUV and the rain cloud blazer. She told me the board would be challenging the injunction. She told me the matter would be resolved in the HOA's favor once the proper documentation was reviewed. She used the phrase proper documentation twice, which I found interesting given that her board had produced none. I thanked her for coming. She stood there for a moment as though she had expected something other than that. Then she got back in the white SUV and drove away down the gravel road, my gravel road, the one described in the 1961 deed, the one that ran along the western edge of my south pasture and connected the Clearwater Ridge development to the county route. She drove away without a second thought because it had not yet occurred to her to wonder who owned it. That was a question whose answer was already in the record. It had been there since the 14th of March, 1961. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be read aloud. Gerald had a habit, when the situation was serious, of spreading documents across a surface before he spoke about them. It was not theater. It was the way he thought, spatially, with the instruments visible, so that every claim could be checked against its source in real time. When I arrived at his office on a Thursday afternoon in early April, the conference table was already covered. The 1947 deed on the left, the 1953 deed beside it, the 1961 deed at the center, the 1994 survey plat folded out to its full width, anchored at the corners with a stapler, a coffee mug, and 2 manila folders. And at the far right, a document I had not seen before, a copy of the Clearwater Ridge Plat of Record, filed with the county when the development was platted in 1997. Gerald had drawn a red line on the plat, It ran along the western boundary of the Clearwater Ridge Common area, and it did not match the line the HOA believed it matched. He let me look at it for a long moment before he said anything. The HOA's plat, he said, describes their western boundary as the center line of the existing gravel road, not the eastern edge of the road, the center line. I looked at the line he had drawn and then at the language in the 1961 deed, which described the right-of-way as 30 feet wide, measured from the surveyed center line, with the full width of the road surface and its maintained shoulders falling within my property. So their plat puts their boundary inside my right-of-way, I said. Inside your deeded property, Gerald said. Not just the right-of-way. The road itself, the gravel surface, the drainage ditches on either side, the culvert at the creek crossing, all of it is within the 30-foot corridor described in your 1961 instrument. Their plat assumes the road is a shared access route or a county road. It is neither. It is your private property, described by meets and bounds, recorded 62 years ago, and no subsequent instrument has ever altered that description. I sat with that for a moment. Outside Gerald's window, the town was going about its business in the mild April air. I thought about Patricia Lund driving that road every time she came to my fence line. I thought about the Clearwater Ridge maintenance crew that used it twice a week to service the new clubhouse construction. I thought about the concrete trucks that had used it through February and March, their weight pressing into the gravel that my grandfather had laid and my father had graded and I had maintained for the better part of 40 years. None of them had ever asked permission. It had simply not occurred to any of them to wonder whether permission was required. What does that mean for access? I asked. Gerald chose his words with the care of a man who has learned that precision is a form of kindness. It means, he said, that every vehicle that has used that road to access the Clearwater Ridge Common Area has been using your private property without authorization. The HOA has no recorded easement, no prescriptive right, and no legal basis for continued use. The question of access, which they have not yet thought to ask, is entirely within your authority to resolve. Gerald filed the title search results with the circuit court the following week as a supplemental exhibit. The exhibit was 41 pages. It included the full chain of title for the western parcel from 1961 forward, a certified copy of the 1994 survey plat, a legal description of the road right-of-way with measurements, and a one-page summary prepared by a licensed title examiner named Ruth Calloway, who had worked the county register for 30 years before opening her own firm, and who had a reputation for finding exactly the thing that other people had been too careless to look for. Ruth's summary was 3 paragraphs. The first described the chain of title, the second described the right-of-way, the third was a single sentence. No recorded easement, license, or right of access exists in favor of the Clearwater Ridge Homeowners Association or its predecessors in interest over the road described herein. 1 sentence. 41 pages of documentation behind it. That is how a record speaks when it has been kept properly. The HOA's response to the supplemental filing cited a theory of implied easement by prior use, arguing that because the road had been used by the development since its platting in 1997, a right of access had been established by course of conduct. The argument was not without legal surface area. Implied easements by prior use do exist in Tennessee law, and the HOA's attorney, a man named Bryce Whitfield who practiced out of Nashville, had written the argument with some care. But the argument had a problem, and the problem was the record. Implied easement by prior use requires, among other things, that the use have been open, continuous, and under a claim of right. It does not arise from use premised on a mistaken belief about ownership. The HOA had used the road because they believed it was either a county road or a shared access route. They had never claimed it as their own. They had never asked for permission, which meant they had never been denied it, which meant the pattern of use was not a claim of right, but a simple error. An error that Gerald documented with 3 affidavits. One from Dale Hutchins, confirming the road had always been known in the community as the Whitmore Road, one from a retired county engineer named Harold Beach, confirming the road had never been accepted into the county road system and had never appeared on any county maintenance schedule, and one from me, describing the maintenance work I had performed on the road surface, the drainage ditches, and the creek culvert at my own expense over the preceding 15 years. Dale had come by the farm the evening before I signed my affidavit. He sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and told me the mood at the HOA was shifting. Word had gotten out among the residents that the board had built a clubhouse on land they did not own, and the reaction was not uniformly supportive of Patricia Lunn's position. One resident, a retired school teacher named Marjorie Oakes, had stood up at the most recent meeting and asked Patricia directly whether the board had obtained a title search before breaking ground. Patricia had said the board had relied on the plat of record. Marjorie had said, quietly but clearly, that relying on your own plat without checking the adjoining deed was not the same thing as doing due diligence. Dale said Patricia had not responded to that. She had moved on to the next agenda item. The circuit court scheduled a hearing on the injunction and the trespass claim for the 3rd week of May. In the weeks between Gerald's supplemental filing and that date, I walked the boundary of the western parcel with a tape measure and a notebook, confirming the position of every survey stake from the 1994 plat. I found all 4 of them, photographed each one with a scale reference and a date stamp, and had the road surface assessed by a local grading contractor who documented the current condition of the gravel, the drainage ditches, and the culvert. He estimated the cost of my maintenance work over the preceding 15 years at just over $11,000. That estimate went into the folder. I also walked the road itself, from the county blacktop to the point where it crossed my north boundary and entered what had been, until the injunction, the active construction site. I walked it slowly, the way my father had walked the fence lines, not looking for problems, but taking inventory. The gravel was my grandfather's gravel, laid in stages over decades, regraded each spring after the frost heaves settled. The culvert at the creek crossing was the one Raymond had installed in 1988, a corrugated steel pipe, 18 inches in diameter, still sound. The road smelled, in the April morning, of wet gravel and new grass at the edges, and of something older underneath, the particular mineral smell of ground that has been worked and tended and kept. I stood at the north end and looked at the clubhouse framing, silent now under the injunction, wrapped in Tyvek that flapped in the mild wind. Someone had spent a great deal of money on it. Someone had made a great many decisions about it without once checking whether the ground beneath the access road belonged to them. I was not angry. What I felt standing at the end of that road was something more like the particular clarity that comes when a complicated situation resolves itself into a simple question. The simple question was this: what does the record say? The record said the road was mine. It had said so since 1961. And a road that belongs to one party and serves the exclusive benefit of another, without any recorded easement or legal authorization, is not a shared resource. It is a private road, and a private road, under Tennessee law, may be used or closed at the discretion of its owner, subject to reasonable notice and the absence of any contrary legal obligation. There was no contrary legal obligation. Gerald had confirmed that twice. The discovery was not dramatic. There was no single document that arrived in an envelope and changed everything. It was the accumulation of the record, deed by deed, plat by plat, affidavit by affidavit, that made the situation legible. The HOA had simply never done the basic title check, and in the absence of that check, they had built their entire understanding of the situation on 2 assumptions: that the fence line was the property line, and that the road was a public or shared route. Both assumptions were wrong. Both had been wrong since before the development existed, and the record, patient and indifferent as county records always are, had been waiting 62 years for someone to read it carefully enough to understand what it said. Gerald called me on a Friday evening, 2 days before the May hearing, to tell me that Bryce Whitfield had reached out with a settlement inquiry. The HOA was prepared to discuss a resolution, a permanent easement over the road in exchange for a release of the trespass claim and a negotiated contribution to the cost of clubhouse relocation, which they were now acknowledging would need to occur. I told Gerald I would think about it over the weekend. I drove out to the south pasture that evening and checked the fence line along the north boundary. The cattle were on the lower field, moving slowly in the last of the light. The cedar ridge to the south was dark against a pale sky. The creek was running well, and I could hear it from the fence line, a sound I had been hearing my entire life, steady and indifferent to the particular difficulties of any given season. The survey stakes were where they had always been. The fence posts were solid. The gravel road ran along the western edge of the pasture the way it had run since before I was born, and it was mine, and it had always been mine, and the record had never said otherwise. The question was simply what I intended to do with what the record said. The hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in the third week of May, in a courtroom on the second floor of the county courthouse that smelled of old wood and the particular stillness of a room where consequential things happen without ceremony. The judge was the Honorable Diane Carver, who had been on the circuit bench for 11 years and who was known, in Gerald's estimation, for reading every word of every exhibit before she opened her mouth. Patricia Lund was there with Bryce Whitfield, younger than I had imagined from his letterhead, mid-40s, a good suit, the careful posture of a man who has learned to perform confidence in rooms where confidence is currency. 2 other board members sat behind them in the gallery. They sat with the particular stillness of people who have been told by their attorney to say nothing and are finding that instruction more difficult than expected. Gerald and I sat at the plaintiff's table. Gerald had his documents in 3 labeled folders. I had brought nothing except the manila envelope containing the original 1947 deed, the 1961 deed, and the 1994 survey plat, the same envelope my father had kept them in. I set it on the table in front of me and left it there, closed, because everything that needed to be said was already in Gerald's folders. Judge Carver had reviewed the briefs. That was apparent from the first minutes of the proceeding when she asked Bryce Whitfield a specific question about the implied easement argument, specifically whether the HOA had any documentation of a claim of right over the road prior to Gerald's supplemental exhibit. Whitfield said the HOA had relied on its plat of record and the historical pattern of use. Judge Carver asked whether the HOA had ever notified Carl Whitmore of that claim of right, in writing or otherwise, at any point prior to the commencement of construction. Whitfield said the board had not believed such notification was necessary, as the road had been treated as a shared access route. Judge Carver looked at him for a moment. Treated as a shared access route by whom? She asked. Whitfield said by the development, by its residents, and by its contractors. And by Mr. Whitmore, she said. Whitfield said he could not speak to Mr. Whitmore's understanding. His understanding, Judge Carver said, is documented in 3 affidavits, a title examiner's report, and 62 years of recorded instruments. I have read all of them. She turned to Gerald. Counsel, I've reviewed the chain of title. I don't see a gap. Walk me through the right-of-way language in the 1961 instrument. Gerald read the relevant passage aloud. The language was clear. 30 feet wide, measured from the surveyed center line, the full corridor described by meets and bounds, recorded in the county register on the 14th of March, 1961. Gerald then read Ruth Calloway's single operative sentence. No recorded easement, license, or right of access exists in favor of the Clearwater Ridge Homeowners Association or its predecessors in interest over the road described herein. The courtroom was quiet when he finished. Judge Carver issued her ruling from the bench. She found that the construction of the Clearwater Ridge Clubhouse had occurred on land owned by Carl Whitmore, as described in the 1961 deed and confirmed by the 1994 survey, and that the HOA had no legal basis for that construction. She vacated the HOA's claim to the common area designation over the disputed parcel. She ordered the HOA to remove the structure within 120 days or face a daily fine of $250. She awarded me the costs of the boundary survey, the title examination, and the attorney fees associated with the injunction proceedings, which Gerald had documented at just over $18,000. She noted, in language that was precise and without embellishment, that the HOA's implied easement argument failed on every required element. The use had not been under a claim of right, had not been adverse to the owner's interest in any documented sense, and had been premised entirely on a mistaken assumption about ownership that a basic title search would have corrected before the first shovel broke ground. She did not say anything unkind about Patricia Lund or the board. She did not need to. The record had already said everything that needed saying. Gerald explained the road question in the parking lot outside the courthouse, standing in the warm May air with his folders under his arm. The ruling had addressed the trespass and the structure directly, but road access going forward was a matter the judge had not been asked to rule on. The HOA still needed that road. Their clubhouse, even slated for removal, had been designed and built with it as the only practical access. Their residents had been using it for 26 years, and now, with the ruling entered in the record, they had no legal right to use it at all. Gerald said the HOA would almost certainly return with a formal easement request. He said I had the right to negotiate terms, to grant a permanent easement in exchange for fair compensation, or to decline entirely. I told him I would let him know. I drove home the long way, down the county route, and then up the gravel road to the farm. The gravel crunched under the truck tires the way it always had, crushed limestone over compacted base, the sound of 40 years of my own upkeep. The creek ran under the culvert at the crossing with the same steady voice it always had. The south pasture was green and full on both sides of the fence line, the cattle moving slowly in the afternoon light, the cedar ridge dark at the far end. I parked at the house and sat for a while with the engine off. What I decided next was not impulsive. I had been thinking about it since Gerald first told me in April that the road was mine and the HOA had no recorded easement. The question was not whether I had the right. Gerald had confirmed that twice, and the judge had now confirmed it in writing. The question was whether exercising that right was the appropriate response to what had been done. The HOA had built a structure on my land without asking, without checking, without a survey, without a title search, and without the basic courtesy of a conversation. They had responded to Gerald's first certified letter with dismissal. They had continued construction through the second letter. They had argued through a Nashville attorney that their own error constituted a legal right. Patricia Lund had stood at my fence line and told me the matter would be resolved in the HOA's favor. She had driven my road without a thought, every single time, as though the question of whose road it was had never once occurred to her. I called Gerald that evening and told him I would not be granting an easement. I intended to close the road to unauthorized use, effective upon proper notice consistent with my rights as the owner of record. Gerald said he would prepare the notice, certified mail to the HOA's registered address, with a copy to Bryce Whitfield, giving 30 days' notice of the road closure, which was more than the law required but which was, as Gerald put it, consistent with the standard of a reasonable property owner acting in good faith. The notice went out the following Monday. It was a single page. It cited the deed instrument by book and page number. It cited the court's ruling on the trespass and the vacated common area claim. It stated that the road described in the 1961 instrument was private property, that no easement or right of access had been granted to the Clearwater Ridge Homeowners Association or its members, and that use of the road by HOA vehicles, contractors, or residents would cease within 30 days. The return receipt came back 4 days later. Someone at the HOA had signed for it. Bryce Whitfield called Gerald 2 days after that. He said the board was prepared to negotiate a permanent easement on reasonable terms. Gerald relayed the message to me without editorial comment, which was his way of leaving the decision entirely in my hands. I told Gerald the terms were not open for negotiation. The road was closing on the 31st day. The gate went up on a Tuesday morning in late June. I had ordered it from the farm supply in town, a 14-foot galvanized steel gate, hinged to a treated 6x6 post set 18 inches in concrete with a case-hardened padlock. I installed it myself at the south end of the road where it met the county blacktop, the point where every vehicle that had ever accessed the Clearwater Ridge common area had turned off the pavement and onto my gravel. It took about 2 hours. The ground was dry and the post set clean and plumb. When I swung the gate closed for the first time and pressed the padlock through the hasp, it made the sound that a gate makes when it closes on something settled, a short, clean sound, without echo. I stood there in the morning heat with the smell of fresh concrete and cut grass around me, and I looked north along the gravel road toward the cedar line and the creek crossing and the Tyvek-wrapped framing of the clubhouse beyond. The road ran straight and quiet in the early light, the gravel pale and dry, the drainage ditches green at the edges with new summer grass. A pair of mallards came in low over the south pasture and set down on the creek somewhere below the cedar ridge, and I could hear them for a moment before the sound of the water took over. I locked the gate, put the key in my coat pocket, and walked back to the truck. That gate was the end of the Clearwater Ridge HOA's access to their clubhouse on my pasture. There was no other road. There was no alternate route. The county blacktop ran along the eastern boundary of their development, but it did not connect to the common area from that side. The topography did not allow it without a bridge crossing the creek, and they had no easement over the creek corridor either, which was also, as it happened, my land. The clubhouse that Patricia Lund's board had poured and framed and wrapped in Tyvek was now accessible only by foot across ground they had been ordered by a circuit court judge to vacate. Their contractor could not reach it. Their maintenance crew could not reach it. Their residents could walk to it if they chose, but they could not drive to it, and they could not work on it, and they could not remove it without first coming to me. They came to me 3 weeks later. Not Patricia Lund. She did not come again. It was two of the other board members, a man named Terry Alcott and a woman named Susan Briggs, who arrived in Terry's truck, parked at my gate, and called my number from the county blacktop. I drove down and met them there. They were polite. They said the board understood the situation and wanted to resolve it constructively. They asked whether I would consider a temporary access license to allow the demolition contractor to reach the clubhouse for removal. I told them Gerald would handle the terms. Gerald negotiated a temporary access agreement, 60 days, specific hours, a daily use fee of $150, and a requirement that the contractor restore the road surface to its pre-use condition upon completion. The HOA signed it within a week. The demolition began the following Monday, and I watched the first truck come through the gate on a July morning with the kind of attention you give to things that have been a long time in arriving. The structure was gone by the end of August. The circuit court's ruling was entered in the county record on the 28th of May. The HOA filed a notice of appeal on the 15th of June, which Gerald had anticipated. The appeal was denied 7 months later in a one-paragraph order that cited the lower court's findings of fact and concluded that the record supported the judgment in its entirety. The board voted to remove Patricia Lund as president at a special meeting in August. The vote was 6-1. 3 of the 4 board members who had approved the construction project without a title search resigned in the months that followed. The new board hired a property attorney to conduct a full title review of all Clearwater Ridge common areas. That review took 4 months. I do not know what it found. That is their business. By the first frost of that year, the south pasture was quiet again. The concrete slab was gone. The framing was gone. The disturbed earth had been graded and seeded, and the new grass was coming in thin and pale at the edges of the repair, tentative, not yet settled into itself, but growing. The fence line along the north boundary was intact. The survey stakes were where they had always been. The gravel road ran along the western edge of the pasture, the way it had run since 1961, closed at the south end by a gate that was mine to open or close as I saw fit. I walked that fence line on a November morning, moving from post to post in the cold air, checking the wire, testing the staples, reading the ground the way you read something you have tended long enough to know by feel. The frost was silver on the grass. The creek was running well below the cedar ridge. The mallards were gone south by then, but the water was still there, steady and indifferent, the same water it had always been. The lesson is simple enough that it does not require elaboration, but I will state it plainly because plain statements are the ones that hold. When an institution with apparent authority makes a claim against you, against your land, your access, your rights as an owner of record, the first question is not whether they seem confident, or whether their letterhead is impressive, or whether their attorney practices out of Nashville. The first question is whether their claim has a legal foundation. And the answer to that question is never in their confidence and never in their letterhead. It is in the record. It has always been in the record. The record does not raise its voice. It simply waits, patient and indifferent, for someone to read it carefully enough to understand what it says. The deed is in the drawer where my grandfather put it. The gate is at the end of the road where I put it. Neither one has moved.